So welcome to this expert panel discussion on climate change and climate policy. My name is Guy Hoban. I'm a faculty member here at Ivey. I'm also the director of the Ivey Energy Policy Management Centre, which is sponsoring this event. So one of the mandates of the centre is to encourage fact-based discourse and dialogue on energy policy and environmental issues by bringing in experts from different or complementary perspectives and working in these sectors. So I'm very pleased that we've got two of our local experts on the campus community who have agreed to come and talk about these climate change issues today. So we have local experts, they truly have global reputations. We're very blessed indeed to have one of the world's leading experts on climate change. Gordon McBean is a professor in the geography department here. He's also the president for the International Council for Science. He's been involved in the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction for many years. And very importantly, Gordon has been one of the key members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the international panel that's really brought together the world's scientists to promote and to understand the impact of human development on the climate environment. This is a panel that was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2007. And since then, Gordon has continued to take a leading role in the IPCC. So next to Gordon, we have Radoslav Dimitrov, who is a professor in the political science department. Rado's expertise is on international climate change and treaty negotiations. This is what he does research on, and he also lectures on it and teaches it in a number of courses here. Has a very unique position because he's also an active participant in these COP treaty negotiations. So Rado has been a formal UN delegate at the COP meetings, most recently in Paris. Just told me earlier that his first meeting that he went to was in 2004. So he's been to a number of these meetings over years, increasingly taking a more senior position role in these international negotiations. He's also the representative for the country of Bulgaria in these meetings. So Rado really has this very unique insight perspective on how the COP treaty negotiations actually play out. He's been there, he's been in the chambers, he's actually been negotiating. So a very interesting blend here of academic and practitioner perspectives. So we're thrilled to have you both here to share with us the benefits of your expertise and experience. We've asked them to distill their expertise into 15 minutes each. So we're going to have two 15-minute presentations, and then that should allow us 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A. So will you please join me in welcoming Gordon and Rado.
Well, thank you. I'm going to go very quick because I'm still not used to 15-minute talks, so I make a 20-minute presentation for all time to time. So let's go. First of all, I'm going to talk about climate and related issues. One of the things, since I put up this image, I had the pleasure or otherwise of meeting with Minister Glenn Murray last week, and he ranted and raved about this NOAA website, called NASA website, sorry. Anyway, that's it. That's 2015 is the warmest year on record, and as you can see, we're there. It's the warmest year on record in terms of measurements of human things. So welcome back to that slide later. I just wanted to say that I think we need to talk about climate change, but we also need to keep in perspective the other issues, and this is just a sort of symbolic sense of the other issues that need to be brought together. And we need to think about, what is the evidence? I'm a scientist. Now, a policy wonky, but by the way, I was actually at top 2 and 3 in whatever the one in Montreal was called. Anyway, do we have the evidence? What is reliable? How do we deliver scientific information to decision makers is also a challenge for us. The IPCC reports as part of the process, but they've gotten to be rather large. And most ministers, I was an assistant deputy minister for 6 years in Environment Canada, and I would say no minister I had would spend more than 1 page on any topic. So you have to think about how do you get that information through in that way. What is the assessment process? Is it local, national, international? And the roles of international science, and that's what I'm involved in now, so I'll talk about it. But just to say that we need to bring this together in terms of, as I say, evidence-based information integrated across these issues, not dealing with just climate change by itself, but in a broader sense of these issues. As we know, 2015-16 has been a great years. We have, which most of you probably don't know, you all know about COP21, but how many ever heard of the Sendai meeting in March 2015, the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction? Okay, a big assembly of people. Agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 by the UN General Assembly. Again, a science process to feed in what should be, and I'll come back to these quickly. COP21, as we always talk about, it gets much more publicity, but I think the other ones are just as important in this context. And we'll have a General Assembly, an Environmental Assembly in May this year. One of the roles for the science community is to get that science and policy into practice, and this Council for Science that I'm now the president of internationally, we are identified as what's called the Science and Technology Major Group. When you go to UN negotiations, there's a major group for business, for women, for children, for, I don't know, whatever. And they have one called the S&T Major Group, which means you get sometimes 3 minutes to make a presentation. But you do get allowed to get into the certain sessions, you can decide who can be there and all that kind of stuff. So it's an important role, and we're trying to do it more effectively than maybe we used to. So, for example, well, this is the Council for Science. It's a non-governmental organization. It goes back a long time. We've got 120-some member countries, including Canada, but they're not as countries. They're national academies of science and that kind of thing. They're members, 31 unions by discipline, math, physics, chemistry, but also psychology, sociology, etc. And we have the mission to develop science, strengthen science for the benefit of society. And we work in 3 areas. And I'll just talk very briefly, science for policy and how we try to coordinate international research that can then feed into that policy process. And this goes back a long way. How many people besides me and a couple of my colleagues who've just come in the room here were old enough to stand on your front porch in 1957 and see Sputnik go by? Anyone ever heard of Sputnik besides me? Well, interestingly, I did. As a kid, I stood and watched Sputnik go over through the sky. So you hear it, you saw it. And that was the first ever human object deliberately put in space. And why was it there? Why 57? Well, it actually was part of an international geophysical year science program that was planned out to start the first systematic measurements of CO2, the first systematic measurements of ozone. Not because there was a climate convention or an ozone convention, it was a science interest. And quite frankly, in those days, you could challenge the Soviet Union. I wasn't involved in that, obviously, but I was involved in one later. You could challenge the Soviet Union and America and say, okay, which one of you guys can get the first spacecraft up there? And the Russians won, and they bragged about it for decades. So, anyway, we've had programs going back, this one, 1967 to 70 was on climate. The World Climate Research Program was started in 1980. Again, driven by the science thing, but starting now to address the issues as people were talking about it. I actually chaired the World Climate Research Program Science Committee from 88 to 94. And these are big projects. We were coordinating about $1 billion a year of research around the world. We could get 30, 40 ships at sea to make measurements of the ocean, that kind of thing. Anyway, let me just say we put together all of these projects, and in the 80s, the middle 80s, the Council for Science and others were putting out statements saying climate change is an issue. And some guy named Ronald Reagan, who you hear a lot about in the media recently, through a certain candidate, he said to his chief of the weather business, shut that outfit down, get it under government control. So, a Canadian, who many of you should know, but you probably don't, Jim Bruce, who happened to have an international job, then convened a meeting and created the IPCC to create something quasi under government control, but still science-based. And so the IPCC was created in '88, And we worked like hell to get the first report out to feed into the Climate Convention meeting in '92, which I think published in 1990. And it's continued since as a formal process of feeding to the Climate Convention thing. The biodiversity has a similar thing, and I'll just skipping right along now. We've got all these programs, and I'm not going to go on to them much, but since I don't have much time. But one of the things just on the science policy side is when we were meeting on the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, there was no IPCC equivalent. There is no process in the international community by which you assess what you know scientifically and what you don't know. Can you predict an earthquake, for example? That kind of questions. And so that's why I showed this little dash line. Similarly, we created a program on health, which is also, again, will feed into the World Health Organization thing. So anyway, I'm recognizing mine. But I guess one of the things that we need to think about is that we've got all these issues, going back to my earlier slide, of health, on disasters, on climate change, etc. How do we integrate across them so we don't have a climate process that goes that way separately from a sustainable development system versus a disaster system, etc. And the one way of linking them is to try and get the science communities and teams to work together. That's what we're trying to do. So, Sendai framework, just to say, first of all, that if you look around the world, that although you hear about the earthquakes, that they're a bigger bang when they happen, that about 75% of the disasters around the world and about 75% of the costs of total of disasters around the world are due to floods, storms, and droughts. They're the climate system. So these things are highly linked. And I think we did a good job in getting the agreement in Sendai to get science into it, understand disaster risk, risk governance, etc. So this program is now underway. We have an international program which we were planning on going to get very quickly through, just to say there is a program on disaster risk reduction, and the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction is part of it. And we also have a program on urban health. I'm going to skip over this just to say there is one, but again to say that issues of flooding, heating, the biggest incidents caused in the United States of actually, in terms of deaths, is actually heat. It's not hurricanes. More people die of heat stroke and heat wave than they do in hurricanes. Partially because they happen more often, but that's the other reality. So what are the Sustainable Development Goals? Here they are, and I've just highlighted a few words in them, the issues of food security. If you're talking to Minister Glenn Murray anytime in the next 48 hours, he moves on to another issue in that time frame. But when I was talking to him, it was food, and water as you need it. Food, and that's his big issue right now. Issues of gender equality, issues of sustainable and modern energy for you guys here, sanitation, water. And we have all these international programs. Then you get into issues of number 9 is resilient infrastructure. That's what we want the government of Canada to do now with all its money, is build resilient infrastructure. So the next time a tornado goes through an earthquake, it doesn't break apart and fall apart. And that requires some thinking. Cities and human settlements being safe, resilient, and sustainable. There's one on climate change. And the little asterisk on it here says, we're assuming the Climate Convention will solve that one. And so on. So we've got all these programs. I'm going, oops. We did have, in case you weren't aware, in leading up to COP21, one of the events was a meeting in Toronto called the Climate Summit of the Americas, hosted by the governments of Ontario and Quebec and California. And so you had speakers like, well, there's Al Gore and Kathleen Wynne and Minister Murray, Premier Couillard. You must know who that lady is. That's Liz Dodswell, our new Lieutenant Governor. And this funny looking guy down here is me. More importantly is like Sheila Wakuche, who represents the Inuit people around the north, etc. And so we had a meeting in July and put forward science statements. So, the climate convention, and Rado will talk more about this, just to say it's got parts in it. And I'd just like to say that scientifically, I'll come back to this in a second, the issues of 1.5 degrees C. And notice it says above pre-industrial levels. It's not compared to now, it's compared to what it was in 1850, roughly. Issues of these kind of things. And so adaptation is an important part of climate change. How many people think that if we were to stop our emissions tomorrow, and the whole world was to say, damn it, we've had enough, close all your guys' energy sources and everything, how much do you think that would affect the temperature in 2040 or 2045? Say it.
Very little, not at all.
That's right, basically not at all, because the average CO2 molecule stays in the atmosphere roughly 100 years. The climate system takes about 100 years. It has these long time scales, so that we need to recognize that we're doing, and I 100% agree, we need to do emission reductions, but that will give us the benefits in a sense of a climate area as opposed to the clean jobs and all that stuff, but it will give us the climate benefits post-2050. Between now and then, we've got to adjust and make ourselves less resilient, more resilient, less damaging by storms and floods, etc. So, well, this is, I mean, just one role on the science is that, where did this 2 degrees C, which really came up in a public way at the Copenhagen meeting a few years ago. And it came from this idea of what people called the burning embers diagrams. The science community went through a process of saying, well, if we consider, anyway, there it is, extreme weather events or distribution of income, global and various kinds of things, depending on which graphs you use. Some of them are on ecosystems. But anyway, the idea was to try and go through and say, well, if we look at it in a very integrated global way, if we warm by 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, how much dangerous will it be? So there were people put in a little bit of yellow. It was just we thought, well, maybe an issue. Orange if it's really concerned an issue, and red when we think it's a real issue. We've got real problems, real big risks. So you can see, and so the idea of 2 degrees C is that it's a round number that sort of blocks it off, that most of the reds are, but not all of them are above it. So they happen after 2 degrees C was the idea. There's quite challenges in this now. The scientists are saying, well, maybe we weren't quite right. And the decision was made, and I had no part of this, is that we would measure this with respect to the pre-industrial values. So what happened relative to the 1850s, more or less. So what that means is, and we talk about temperature change in the climate convention, we're talking about values that, and now with the Paris Agreement is saying 2 degrees C, but we're already at 1 degree C, more or less, when you factor in the pre-industrial value. And 1.5 degrees C in my computer I can't seem to get it exactly 1.5, but anyway, imagine that. So there's where the Paris Agreement is putting us. And I'm happy they're doing it, but I'm just raising the question that these risks, the risks we're addressing, but how we're going to get there. If we go quickly to the diagram which I had at the beginning, there was that diagram. If you do my simple paper and pen exercise and extrapolate out to 2050, for example, and just draw that straight line out through, recognizing that the emissions will start to affect after that, then what you get is about 1.5 degrees C warming compared to now, but that's 1.5 with respect to pre-industrial. So under the present trajectory, we're going to hit 1.5 at least by, and I think depending on where you draw the line through this, you could easily see us exceeding 1.5 by mid-century. It's going to be very difficult. So anyway, let me just say to end on a couple of quick slides. I got 20 minutes more, don't I? Anyway, interesting, I don't know if you've seen this, but the World Economic Forum came up with its global risk statement. It came out within the last month. And it was rather interesting, and I've been using this for some policy talks I've been giving. I've been meeting, I chair a committee for Atlantic Camp looking at climate change adaptation. And so they were asked to look at the likelihood of a risk and the impact if the risk happened. So it's a two-dimensional diagram. So what you really want to be worried about is the things up in that corner. And what is, well, the one that is the most likelihood is involuntary, large-scale involuntary migration. But if you then look there, the one that is next most likely to happen, but lower impacts, is extreme weather events. But the one that is the highest in terms of impact and so very likely to happen in their assessment is the failure to actually do what was agreed to in Paris. And they came up with this report a month after Paris, so I had no role in it. Interestingly, if you follow all through it, the climate issue, which is sort of this greeny one, wasn't even here in 2007, and in recent years has now moved to the top. Again, there's recognizing it's important, but also listing it as a very high risk. So, what are we doing internationally in science? We're bringing all this together. We're trying to bring together the human, all kinds of the natural and social sciences into a new program called Future Earth Research for Global Sustainability. And it has three themes: dynamic planet, global development, transformations towards sustainability. So your energy program should be filling us with all kinds of good ideas on innovation in there. And this program is working in what we call a co-design, co-produce, co-delivery. For the first time in these international science programs, we have a science committee. We also have an engagement committee, where the engagement committee are stakeholder community reps, various kinds of people that are from all around the world in this case. The Canadian on the engagement committee is Scott Bond, the president of the International Institute of Sustainable Development, former commissioner for Environment, Sustainable Development, Government, etc. And so we're trying to do all this, and I'm going to be meeting with people, I am meeting with people already to set up the Canadian research program on sustainable, future Earth sustainable development. So the idea we want to do is take all this stuff, integrate it, so we have an intersecting issue and a common integrated science to policy, build capacity, worry about data issues. And the other thing we're doing, to finish my last slide, is we've created a international group network of science advisors. The guy who's chairing it is Sir Peter Gluckman, the Prime Minister of New Zealand science advisor. And just some of the others are interesting. This is Morenci, who is head of the Third World Academy of Sciences. Zachary is the Malaysian science advisor, etc. Heather Douglas, a professor of political science at the University of Waterloo, just to show we have some academics on it. And okay, for the challenge, who is that guy? You've been watching the news all lately, other than the election results. Where has Obama been lately?
Well, Castro.
Yeah. Well, this is actually Fidel Castro's son, who was actually a very good, eminent scientist. I first met him in Havana, and as they took him up, we chatted, and then they walked away, and I said, for God's sake, look, I've never seen Fidel Castro, I've only seen old pictures of him. I thought he looked, and they said, that actually is his son. He's very good guy. Anyway, we're meeting with this crowd, and so the idea is that we have science to worry about the tipping points. We build science on the base of science. This is Einstein's statue, and my grandkids and daughter and son-in-law are sitting on the statue. And so with that, we're going to solve future Earth. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Welcome everyone. It's really very, very encouraging. It feels wonderful that there's so many people attending this event, indicating a level of interest. I think that the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, negotiated last December, is one of the most historical moments in modern history because it has sealed developments that have begun to occur over the last 10 years. That will only continue, and the Paris Agreement is only the beginning in a long series of agreements that are going to be underlying a global transition to clean development. Just so that this is not an abstract topic, I took most of these pictures with a camera. Lots of things happened in Paris. Big conference, 2 weeks, 38,000 people were there. The real negotiations take place in small groups like this. among very small number of individuals. The heads of states don't really matter. They're a real nuisance to all negotiators, and diplomats just wait until they go away. That's why they ask them to come the first 2 days and they stop, just leave. You can ask me later if there's time something about spicy details about Al Gore. This is who is on that picture over there next to the French foreign minister. This is our new environment minister, Catherine McKenna, speaking with John Kerry, who is completely addicted to photo opportunities. What I want to say is that Paris is not what produced the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement has been was negotiated over the past 4 years, following a legal mandate adopted in South Africa in 2011. There have been many, many rounds of negotiations, at least 15 formal rounds of multilateral UN talks. Many of them took place in Germany, but also around the world, with very, very intense conversations between key players. The agreement is a full-fledged international treaty that contains policy obligations on every conceivable aspect of this enormous problematic, from mitigation to adaptation to finance to international cooperative mechanisms. What I would like to say first about it is that most of the key elements of it were negotiated in secret. The treaty itself is a mélange, it's a composite collection of specific deals that were made on all the crucial issues, very privately, behind closed doors, between very, very small number of countries. The French presidency had a very conscious approach to reduce the number of players involved, because everybody has to be involved, all 200 governments, and that has been an obstacle in the past. They broke up the issues, identified the key ones, and then identified the key players on each issue, and then they tried to reach a private agreement on each issue only among the few countries that are considered key players, and then crucially keep everybody else in the dark for as long as possible so that you don't provoke opposition. Specific example, one of the 6 main working groups that were established in Paris to attack the 6 most contentious issues was on so-called response measures. Response measures pertains in the negotiations to the negative economic impact of climate policy. This is an issue introduced by Saudi Arabia in the 1990s, and the Saudis had been arguing that if the world moves away from fossil fuels, it will be devastating to their own economy, and they need to be compensated for that. This is to put it very, very simply. They have been, keeping it on the table ever since. Very persuasive, very effective communicators. And I was asked to represent the European Union in a secret meeting where the EU was asked officially to take a position on a secret deal that was reached between Saudi Arabia and the United States on response measures. And the meeting was completely off record. It took place in a tiny little room, 5 by 5 meters. There were only 10 individuals in the room. We were explicitly told that we cannot take any phone pictures of the screen. They wouldn't have any hard copy, any paper copies of the actual deal. And what is really interesting about this episode is that we approved the deal. We made some statements, but we said we're fine with it. Turned out that all key players were fine with the deal. What is really interesting is that over the next 2 days, when the French circulated the next official drafts of the Paris Agreement, that private deal was not actually reflected in the official text. In fact, the official text was exactly the opposite in political meaning from what we knew had been agreed upon. Why? Because the French wanted to keep everybody uninformed until the last moment, so that so nobody protests that deal. And the deal basically was to not create any new institutional arrangements for response measures that can lead to compensation for negative economic impacts of climate policy. Right. We fell back on a previous arrangement, the Warsaw Mechanism. It's a long story, but basically the issue, the agreement was not to go anywhere with this. The French threw the agreement in the text only in the last moment. They basically collected all the private deals negotiated over the previous year. They threw them together in the text in the last moment, and they said it's a take it or leave it text. Nobody can reopen anything for negotiations. You can only approve it or reject it, and that put a lot of pressure on countries to not reject it, because then they would be seen as the black sheep. So the secret workings were really key to achieving that kind of political success. Eventually, however, nobody protested those kinds of approaches, because the deal overall is a very balanced agreement that gives something to everybody. It tries to meet the key demands by for most players. So what is in the Paris Agreement then? First of all, oh, okay.
There we go. Let's go back.
All right. So what is in the Paris Agreement? First of all, this is the first global agreement, truly global one, that does not exempt any group of countries from climate policy the way to the Kyoto Protocol did. Okay, so it's the first one. Second one, it's very comprehensive with very substantive policy obligations. And third of all, it is legally binding for the most part. Some parts are more legally binding than others. What I would like to say to people who are interested in where this whole thing is going, the new global climate deal is an experiment in international law. At least that's my understanding, and Sarah Seck, who is in the audience, can comment much more expertly on this. This is an experiment because the treaty is a hybrid between the so-called top-down and so-called bottom-up approach to international law. It is not a standard treaty that simply sends down obligations to countries and expects to implement them. It gives a lot of freedom to countries, to governments, to determine what their domestic policy is going to be. However, it does clearly create a principled legal obligation to act. Therefore, in very sort of pedestrian language, it tells governments, you do whatever you want, but you must do something, and you have to declare it. If this was the only thing in the treaty, that would have been a very bad, weak arrangement. What is much more important is that once a government ratifies, it's under legal obligation to actually regularly go back to their policies and renew them every 5 years at least. And crucial, so there's an element of regularity, but most crucially, every next installment of the domestic national policy has to be actually more ambitious, stronger than the previous one. Therefore, the Paris Agreement seeks to lock the international community into an upward trajectory of ever-accelerating action on climate and energy. At least the countries who ratify. And as every treaty ever negotiated, its fate partly depends on the number of ratifications. Early on, in the first week, we were told that the United States is so strongly against the legally binding deal that the EU Commissioner told us privately, if we insist on strong legally binding language, we will lose the United States and we will not have a global agreement. The US tried to be positive, but in the last moment, these two photos that I took from just before the last session began. I'm here with some of my colleagues, two of which are ministers, the Minister of the Environment in Finland and of Luxembourg, who presided over the EU. This is the head of the Belgian delegation, that's me. We are sort of waiting for the meeting to begin. Everybody's there. The French appear at the podium. There is this incredible sense of exhilaration and trepidation. What's going to happen? We will literally know whether there is a success or not. And for some reason, half an hour goes by and the meeting doesn't start, and at some point the French disappear from the podium altogether, and you knew that something is going on. Peter, while we're talking, receives a text message, and the text says, the US wants should. What this refers really to is to a clause in the treaty that states that developed countries, in the original draft, shall continue to take the lead by undertaking economy-wide absolute emission reduction targets. This is the strongest legal language that you can use. Shall is very definitive, it's very forceful. It means truly legally binding obligation. The United States said we want to change that, shall to should, which makes it less legally binding. The meeting was postponed for 1.5 hours for two reasons. Because of the US demand and because Nicaragua told the French immediately that they're going to reject the Paris Agreement. The meeting started at around 7 o'clock on Saturday, and the European Union had already decided very reluctantly to accept the US demand as the price to pay to actually see a global deal emerging. Other key provisions pertain to mandatory global reviews of policies, and those reviews will pertain to both domestic and global level policies that will basically take place every 5 years. The compliance provisions are fairly weak. There's a compliance committee set up that is supposed to work on in quote-unquote non-adversarial, non-punitive manner. That is not uncommon. Most international environmental agreements are with compliance mechanisms, and yet most of them are implemented quite well, so that in itself does not mean that the agreement is weak, or doesn't necessarily so. And then finally, the treaty will enter into force if and when at least 55 governments ratify, accounting for 55% of global emissions. So what I would like to say is that I have participated in these negotiations for a very, very long time. From the perspective of everybody who is involved, knowing what has happened behind doors, we all consider this a remarkably and frankly surprising success, because it comes in the wake of a series of stunning failures to create anything. And many diplomats have shared the view that the Paris Agreement is actually stronger than what they expected to see. There are some very real policy implications, because countries who choose to ratify will, as I said, be obliged to introduce, implement, and progressively increase their policy ambition. Those who do not ratify will come under a great deal of public pressure that is going to be overwhelming, particularly because now the United States and China have a bilateral agreement from 2014, and those are the two biggest emitters, and they are exercising their muscle to force other countries to follow suit and take action. So the political cost of not joining the Paris Agreement is going to be very, very considerable, and it will grow over time, in my estimate. This is going to be a slow process. This is going to be an incremental process. My personal view is that now we are part of an irreversible process at the global level. There is no turning back. The process may be very slow at times, but it clearly points in one direction, and that is towards green development, that is towards a green shift away from fossil fuels. And lost the... Pardon?
Just try plugging down that way. Why? My computer is.
I would like to thank you, and Gordon and I will be very, very glad to entertain questions that you may have. I hope this is useful.
Thank you, Rado and Gordon, for expanding our horizons globally beyond what we know is happening here in Canada. So we have some time for questions. Would anyone like to kick off? Don't be shy. Otherwise, I can call someone. All right, yes.
Firstly, thank you both for joining us today. I learned a lot in this discussion. I'm sure everyone else in the room did. My question is specifically addressed to Mr. Dimitrov. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on the relationship between diplomatic policy action and the kinds of, pushback and mobilized groups such as like the Zapatista movement in Mexico that really do try to involve an indigenous voice in policy action. Do you think that relationship between diplomats and indigenous groups, or mobilized groups looking for climate, environmental changes, do you think that relationship can be strengthened through reports like this, through meetings like the one you attended in December?
Would you like to go and question?
Yeah, go ahead. Why don't you answer that?
Without any hesitation, the answer is yes. Indigenous groups have been very, very successful in introducing their voices in UN diplomacy. In fact, the only thing that I heard Canada say during the Paris conference officially pertains to, we want references to the rights of indigenous people and gender equality in the preamble of the agreement. Right? They insisted very strongly, and they supported very strongly the references to indigenous rights. So yes, I don't know how much of that is just true commitment and true political willingness to act, but the rhetoric and the words are definitely there.
Yeah, so Gordon, you've seen the science probably evolve a lot over your career, and especially since Kyoto. How is what we have now different from, I guess what's generally seen as failure, I guess, in the last major round of agreements? And I guess to both of you, you've both seen it.
Well, one thing, as Rado's emphasized, is the Paris Agreement is for all countries. The Kyoto Agreement, by agreement previously in the final convention, was that the Annex 1, Annex 8, it was countries. Anyway, the big emitters would take action first. And so in Kyoto, there was the agreement did not put any obligations for, say, China or Brazil or those countries to actually do anything. It was intended to be an initial step of having the major emitters, based on their 100-year record, not their last year record, to take action on climate change. And let's say, and the science and let's say the public support of this, which makes a huge difference politically, has improved a lot. We know with much more confidence. The 95 IPCC assessment said the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on the climate system. I was the head of the Canadian delegation on those negotiations. And the same countries that Rado was talking about were objecting to that phrase. But that balance of evidence suggests. More recently, certainly in the last couple of reports, it says there is no doubt that humans are causing climate change. So that helps in the terms of the science input thing. So there's been an evolution of what we know, and the fact that we've had 10 more years makes people more likely to cause governments to take action compared to in the 90s when they were still just talking about it.
I'd like to add my answer in quantity. Today, and before the beginning of the conference, 186 governments had developed and declared national plans for emission reductions and various related policies, climate and energy. only 9 countries or 10 countries only had not, and those include Libya, Syria, North Korea, Nicaragua, countries that do not really contribute a lot. The countries who do have national domestic plans today account for 96% of all global emissions. Now, clearly, some of that is lip service. I mean, we know that the Carper plan, for example, Canada did submit a domestic plan. The Carper plan doesn't mean anything at all. We know that. But many countries do have something behind those plans. And what is most indicative is that in 2007, there were only 45% of global emissions covered under domestic legislation. Since 2007 to jump all the way to 96, that is a remarkable leap. I don't think we can ignore it.
Can I ask you both to talk a little bit about how Canada's position has changed during the history of these COP negotiations? Canada is a developed country which has got an unusual profile in that we're overweight in our fossil fuel industry. Oil and gas is an important driver of our economy and of our standard of living, which clearly creates a tension in terms of trying to achieve environmental goals. So could you both provide some insights into how Canada has managed this sort of tension between environmental and energy issues over the history of COP over the last 10 or 20 years?
Gordon talks to ministers.
Yeah.
Well, I'd have to say that the climate issue was not that big an issue. And I was an assistant deputy minister from 94 to 2000. In the Chrétien government, I had 4 different ministers in that 6-year period. The ministers who were head of our delegation for the first 3 changed everything. So there was no minister who went more than once in the first few years. So and it really wasn't, I mean, well, interestingly, how many people know what our target was in the Kyoto Protocol?
6%.
-6. And how did we get that target? Because the Prime Minister's office said, and I probably shouldn't be saying this in public, but anyway, the Prime Minister's office said, we had a First Minister's meeting in Canada just before we went to Kyoto. I wasn't at it, but the First Ministers were all there, and they agreed on the target of 0. And so I'm about to get on the plane to fly to Kyoto, and I'm talking with John Fraser, who was our ambassador for the environment, or Joe Clark, the environment minister, actually, a very good guy. And I said, John, I'm going to get off the plane with you, and we're going to have the first question. I'm going to say, what is Canada's position? I assume I say 0. And he said, no, Gordon, don't say anything publicly. I said, well, what do you mean? What is our target? Our target is -3. I said, well, how did we get that? Because someone in PMO thinks we got a the US will be -2, and we're going to be 1 point greener. So anyway, when we got there, in those days, I mean, consider the Chrétien government, we had 2 ministers, but we did have 4 provincial cabinet ministers, including the Minister of Energy from Alberta was on the delegation. And we met every morning, the intergroup, and the group with all the ministers, about the provincial ministers and 4 members of parliament who were not ministers, so from each party. So there was a conservative backbencher there, etc. And then we would then open the doors, and there were probably 70 or 80 NGO groups, the oil companies, the oil associations, and also the Sierra clubs and those kind of people. So it got to be quite a debate. But in the end, the target of -6 came because as we were getting, and I should say that where an individual can make such a difference, and rather than talk about the Paris Agreement, I was really involved in the Kyoto more than anything. And what we had was, I would have said 3 days before it was to close, it was supposed to finish on Wednesday, and on Monday I would have said we would not get any agreement on anything. And Al Gore arrived by plane as vice president. He held meetings, none of which I was invited to, but I saw him pass by with an entourage, racing back and forth between the side sessions. And by that evening, the EU, which had a certain set of rules it was not willing to move on, was changing them, and more flexible. Canada, the US was willing to move up. And in the end, but Canada didn't know what our position was, so in the end, the way we got to -6 was that we had a big guy in our delegation, who I won't say what his name was, but he's told this story in one of my graduate classes a few years ago. His job was to watch out, and he watched around, and he saw the Americans and the Japanese go in the corner, and heard them say, -6, -7, race back to the delegation. So, okay, we're -6. So, but there was very little scientific analysis, and the last time I was at a climate convention meeting was actually in Montreal in 2005, which Canada hosted. And we were actually unknown to, I mean, the history seems to have forgotten that. I think, personally, with Paul Martin as Prime Minister, Stéphane Dion as Minister of Environment, and they asked me to be one of their advisors, so I was involved in these discussions. There was a very strong Montreal action plan that would have come out of that. Unfortunately, in the middle of the COP, a certain government, a motion was passed led by the NDP, non-confidence, and they had to call an election in the middle of it. And so, and then we had the harvest, and Canada won the fossil award almost every one of the 9 years the Harper government was in power, which was given to the country that did the most to make sure nothing happened. Anyway, you were involved in much more. Since then, I haven't been involved in it other than watching them. But,
I'd like to spare you some pain, so I'm not going to say anything.
Afraid to comment. Yes, at the back here.
This is a question for both panelists. Do either of you see any real economic drivers coming out of this conference?
Economic drivers?
Within Canada, for instance, do you see any real policy to be implemented that would create an economic driver within Canada to create motivation towards this agreement or targets?
yeah, I think there is strong drivers in certain provincial levels. I mean, I met with the ministers of both Ontario, Quebec, and BC, but they were part of the same kind of meetings. I think there is a strong interest in taking action in building that clean energy side of things, if that's an economic driver. The other part that's largely forgotten in the Paris Agreement is the sections, articles, I forget the numbers now, 41, 42, something like that, are on adaptation, adapting to it. And there is a strong push from the insurance companies in Canada and several of the provinces that put in place strategies that will reduce our vulnerability and exposure to flood storms, drought, heat waves, etc., which will have economic as well as health and other benefits. I mean, the parliamentary budget officer just put out a statement a matter of weeks ago saying how much it was costing for the number of severe weather events in Canada in the last year. I get the numbers off the top of my head, but they're in the billions. And if we properly adapt to it, we can reduce those numbers. It's a different kind of economics, but it's very much part of our society, and that's why it is infrastructure thing in the latest budget. And I haven't had a chance to read the word, but I've talked to the MPs and minister staff prior to this, and hopefully they've got some good words in there that at least imply it and put some of that into it.
Canada has definitely, piled up a lot of right words. We have a lot of impressive statements, and we have a long history of the right words. I personally haven't seen anything in terms of action to impress me. I hope it will come, partly for economic reasons. I think that the reasons why many other countries have moved already in that direction is precisely to reap the economic benefits and to get a competitive edge. And we haven't. And what is really astounding is that the European Union's negotiating strategy has been based for the last more than 10 years precisely on the concept of win-win solutions. And that is, climate policy can be good for the economy. That's one of the reasons why we should do it. And that, I don't detect any kind of impact of that persistent rhetoric in Canada. I teach, and the students get this incurable conviction that somehow climate policy is expensive, so we shouldn't do it because it's about job. That's completely the opposite of what many other countries are thinking. And so I think that the economic rationale behind energy and climate policies is really here a primary interest. And we really need to continue working with examining every step of the way, because I worry a lot about this.
A question over here, and then I'll come back.
So, that's a twofold question, but I'll make it quick. So, one is about the ambition of the treaty, so limiting to well below 2 degrees. And the other is about the binding aspects of the treaty. So, leading into the conference, scientists have been telling us if we reach 1.5 degrees, it's very bad news. We may or may not be able to deal with a 2-degree increase. And the wording of the agreement is we should aim for 1.5, but keep it well below 2 degrees. So as far as ambitions go, it's not sufficient. The second aspect is about the binding aspect of things. So here, yes, countries commit themselves to doing better and exponentially better every 5 years. But there is no recourse if they fail. So if I say I'm going to drop my emission by 10%, and I miss this target, and then 5 years later say, now I'm going to reduce it by 20% and miss it, nothing happens to me. So there's no court, no country that can sue you for missing your target. So really, you're committing yourself to a lot of lip service here, and perhaps shame. But shame has never stopped anybody, right? So, so as far as the ambition is concerned, and as far as the legality is concerned, I think the summit, the conference, was sold as a great success, and I'm just not sure that it was such good news for the planet. And then I'll conclude with this, and this is a number actually I get from you, Rado. So even if the countries were to meet all of their targets by 2050, the increase would be like 3 degrees, 3.5 degrees, I forget what.
3.6.
3.6 degrees.
Yeah.
See how under-ambitious we are here. And,
I could comment briefly on this. Indeed, if you focus on ecological results, the current agreement and the 186 national plans are not going to be enough. They will be far from sufficient from preventing, really devastating impacts. Right on. The study of international environmental law, however, suggests that in almost every single case, an agreement is followed by other agreements that become more and more ambitious all the time. Right? In political science, we know this as regimes. There are no agreements. There are only policy regimes that consist of a cluster of international agreements. And therefore, my expectation is that, as I said, Paris is just going to be one step along the way, and that it will be followed by other agreements. But I do want to also make a note about your suggestion that somehow if there are no hard penalties, if there are no hard obligations, we won't see action. I would disagree with that. One of the things that I have learned in diplomacy is how many individuals and even entire countries are actually thinking about what is the right thing to do. That is clearly very evident in Scandinavian mentality, where you see very genuine sort of desire to create policy because that is the right thing to do. All those diplomats who negotiate, they are faced almost on a daily basis during the negotiations with evidence from civil society, with numbers. For example, in Durban, we were told by civil society that the previous year 24,000 people at least were victims of climate change impacts that would not have existed without climate change. And so these kind of emotional and moral forces are also at play.
So for one last question.
Well, mine was actually quite similar to that question, but I was just going to ask what exactly makes Paris legally binding versus not legally binding, because I don't understand what the punitive measures are, which I guess you already talked about, but...
I'm sorry that Sarah is not here, but because it's set up as a treaty, It's a standard treaty with all the clauses, with provisions for entry into force. It is completely different from the so-called Copenhagen Accord, which was 2.5 pages of a political declaration. Right? That is not a climate deal. So basically, we're using what international lawyers will tell us. It's a treaty. It's a legally binding one.
Gordon, did you want to add to that?
I'll just say, I think there is, as Rado said, I concur that it's probably, I'm not a legal lawyer and that kind of stuff, but I think that the fact that they agreed to the words there, we'll see how many of them actually ratify it as opposed to sign it. The U.S. signed the Kyoto Accord in Kyoto, but they never ratified it. And so we'll see whether, depending on the election and all the other kind of things, but nonetheless, the fact that there is such an agreement with 180 some countries agreeing to it is a very positive step forward. And we have to continue, as it says in there, we'll have another one and another one and another one. That was the idea in Kyoto, was assumed to be the first of many steps. We have to keep working that way. And what we're trying to do in the non-governmental science community is provide, let's say, information, advice, and quite frankly, putting out statements. Say, we've got to have more of this. And the Sustainable Development Goals, in case you're not aware, have 117 of them with 169 targets. First of all, it's ridiculous, but that's the political process. So we put a group of scientists together and said, well, what do you think of those 169 targets? What's the science basis of them? And the conclusion was that, in round numbers, 25% were pretty good, 50% needed a fair amount of work, and 25% were total nonsense, scientifically. And so by doing that, we're hoping that we can, let's say, influence the process, refine some of these processes.
Royden, did you have a very quick question?
I don't know how quick it is, but I wanted to ask, given Canada's 30% reduction target by 2030, below 2005 levels, how does that compare to other global scale carbon emitters, specifically when you're talking about the US, who have added 5,000 barrels of oil production during Obama's tenure, or China or India, who have a real need for growing power demands and have added a lot of coal. Where is the balance of fairness to the citizens of the planet in this accord?
Justice has been absolutely a cardinal issue in climate negotiations. Fundamental, absolutely fundamental. But it has played out in ways that are slightly different from what you're describing. What I want to say is that the Canada numbers are really not worth talking about at the moment. I refuse basically to discuss anything related to Canada's policy because, as far as I'm concerned, there has been no Canada policy on this. And the fact that a government was able to tell the nation that we do have a policy and even persuade some is a sublime form of cynicism. The reason why Canada has replaced Saudi Arabia as black sheep #1 in climate negotiations, and as Gordon said very accurately, that we have been the absolute champion in getting the largest number of the Colossal Fossil of the Day awards given by Global Civil Society. The sole reason for that is not that we have failed to achieve certain policy goals. It is because we have not even tried. That is the reason why Canada, the world has looked at Canada and considers quite morally suspect.
Right. Well, on that bombshell, I think we'll leave it there. So thank you all for attending. Thank you very much to Gordon and Rado for really providing us with the benefits of your deep insights and experience on this and sharing them so publicly with us. So thank you very much on behalf of everyone.